You've just been humiliated in front of everyone by a white officer who thinks he can get away with it. But what happens when you reveal your true identity? A bombshell revelation, and suddenly, the world shifts. Aaliyah Carter knew this day would come. She had prepared for it. She was ready. But not like this. Not in a courtroom where everyone thought they had the upper hand. The officers who mocked her, the judge who underestimated her, they would soon learn the truth in a way that would shake them to their core. She had been wronged, disrespected, and treated as if her skin color made her invisible. But the woman they saw standing before them was not the person they thought she was. She wasn't just another black woman caught in the system. Aaliyah Carter was more than that, far more. As the doors to the courtroom slammed shut behind her, the tension in the air thickened. She walked to her seat, every step calculated, every move measured. Her calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the chaos around her. She was used to this. The whispers, the stares, the constant feeling of being an outsider. But today was different. Today, she wasn't just a bystander in her own story. Today, she was the one who would turn the tables. The courtroom was eerily silent as Aaliyah took her place. The judge barely looked up from his papers, a man who thought his job was as simple as handing down judgments. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. The officer at the defendant's table, a smug grin on his face, whispered something to his partner. "What's she doing here? This isn't her fight." The others laughed under their breath, but Aaliyah didn't flinch. She didn't respond. She just sat there, her eyes locked on the officer who had made her the target of his scorn. She knew it wasn't about her being in the wrong place or being accused of something she didn't do. It was about the way the system worked, a system that had long been broken, built to keep people like her in check. The officer, a man named Lucas Harper, leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped behind his head. "You know, you people always act like you own the place," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. The crowd in the courtroom shifted, some trying to ignore his words, others glancing nervously at Aaliyah. But she remained still, unmoving. There was no reaction. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a fight. Not yet. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, signaling the beginning of the proceedings. Aaliyah kept her gaze on Harper. His arrogance was palpable, the way he looked down at her as if she were just another person to dismiss. "You're not even supposed to be here," he sneered, raising his voice slightly. "We'll see how long you last." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Aaliyah knew this was the moment, the one that would change everything. She didn't need to say anything to prove her worth. She had something far more powerful than words. She had the truth, and it was coming. As the officer continued his mocking, Aaliyah stood up, her voice calm but carrying enough authority to silence the room. "Actually, Officer Harper, I think you're the one who's mistaken," she said, her tone sharp but controlled. The room fell deathly silent. Harper paused, his smirk faltering for the first time. He looked at her, puzzled. "What?" he asked, as if he couldn't fathom why she would challenge him. That's when Aaliyah revealed the badge, pulling it from her bag with a slow, deliberate motion. She held it up high for everyone to see. The words CIA agent gleamed in the light, sending shockwaves through the room. The air shifted. The officer's face turned white. His entire posture collapsed. All the confidence he had just moments ago vanished in an instant. He didn't know how to respond. "You're," Harper stammered, his voice trailing off. The judge's eyes widened in disbelief. The entire courtroom was stunned into silence. No one could process what had just happened. Aaliyah watched them, every one of them now fully aware of their mistake. She wasn't just a witness or a victim. She was the person who had been secretly watching all along. She had everything on record, everything Harper and his colleagues had done. The corrupt dealings, the abuses of power, they were all in her hands. Now it was her turn. The room was still, the silence deafening as the realization sank in. Harper, who had thought he was untouchable, was now the one who would face the consequences. Aaliyah's calm expression never wavered. "I'm not here for revenge," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm here for justice." And with that, the system that had oppressed her for so long began to crumble. Harper had no idea what was coming next, but Aaliyah did. She had the power to bring it all down, and she wasn't about to let this injustice stand. The courtroom stood still, like a frozen moment in time. Aaliyah's badge gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, its weight now resting on more than just her shoulders. It carried the truth, the truth that had been hidden for far too long. Officer Harper, still unable to process what had just occurred, stumbled back, his face a mix of shock and fear. He had never imagined that the woman he had just humiliated, the woman he had treated like an insignificant pawn, was someone with the power to bring him down. The silence was deafening, but Aaliyah didn't break her gaze. She didn't need to. The truth spoke louder than any words could. The judge, who had barely glanced at her before, now looked at her with wide eyes. His disinterest was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stare as he realized the gravity of the situation. The spectators in the courtroom, who had been too afraid to intervene, now shifted in their seats, unsure of what would come next. Aaliyah remained poised, unshaken by the realization that this moment was only the beginning. She had come prepared. She had known exactly how this would unfold. For years, she had fought to expose corruption, but today, it was more personal. Today, the very system that had been built to silence her, to keep people like her from rising, was crumbling. Aaliyah had never intended for this day to be about revenge. She had a job to do, and that job was to uphold justice. The officer, Harper, who had once acted as if he were above the law, was now just another piece in the puzzle she had been working to solve for years. She had always known that justice would come, even if it took time. Now, that time had arrived. "You don't know who you're messing with," Harper muttered under his breath, though it was clear his confidence had been shattered. But his words were hollow. Aaliyah didn't need to respond. The court had heard enough. The judge cleared his throat, a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. His voice, which had once held authority, now seemed weak. "This is highly irregular," the judge said, but the words sounded more like an excuse than an explanation. Aaliyah's eyes locked onto his, and in that instant, she could see the shift in him. The shift from authority to fear. He had no idea who he was dealing with. The courtroom, which had been filled with tension just moments ago, now felt suffocating. Everyone knew that the game had changed. "It's not irregular," Aaliyah replied, her voice steady, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "It's called accountability. Something you and your officers are clearly lacking." She had been patient long enough. Now, the truth would be exposed, and there was no turning back. Harper's hands, which had been trembling ever so slightly, now gripped the edge of his chair. He was a man used to holding power, but now that power was slipping away. The spectators could sense it, the subtle shift in the room's energy. Aaliyah was in control. The officers who had once stood tall, confident in their ability to intimidate, now seemed small. Harper was no longer the one who commanded attention. Aaliyah's every word, every gesture, had shifted the dynamic. The judge, for all his attempts to maintain authority, knew that the balance of power had tipped. He glanced nervously at the other officers, looking for reassurance, but there was none to be found. Aaliyah was untouchable. She had the upper hand, and they all knew it. "You don't get to make the rules here," Aaliyah continued, her voice calm but firm. "You never did. But today, the truth will. And you will answer for everything." The room held its breath as the words settled. It was clear now that Aaliyah was more than just a victim in this courtroom. She was a force, and the officers who had underestimated her would soon learn just how dangerous that could be. The judge, clearly flustered, shuffled through his papers, trying to find a way to regain control. But Aaliyah was no longer interested in his excuses. She was focused on something far more important: justice. The officer, Harper, now looked like a man on the verge of breaking. His earlier arrogance had been replaced with fear, his every action weighed down by the knowledge that he was about to lose everything. But it wasn't just him. The entire courtroom, every person who had witnessed the injustice unfold, was about to experience a reckoning. And it wasn't going to be pretty. Aaliyah's calmness in the face of such disrespect was the very thing that set her apart. She had endured more than most could imagine, but she had never lost sight of her mission. She had always known that the truth, no matter how long it took, would eventually come to light. And now, standing before those who had tried to bring her down, she knew that it was her time to rise. "You'll regret this," Harper muttered again, his voice shaky now. But Aaliyah's response was simple, unwavering. "No, you will." The courtroom fell into an almost eerie silence, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Aaliyah stood tall, her presence commanding. There was no need for further words. The battle had been fought. The truth had been revealed. And now, all that was left was the inevitable outcome. Justice was on its way, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The courtroom remained unnervingly silent, each second stretching longer than the last. Aaliyah's calm presence stood in stark contrast to the flustered officials around her. Officer Harper, still recovering from the shock of her revelation, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His confident, arrogant posture had completely evaporated. Now, his unease was palpable. His eyes darted from the judge to the other officers, all of whom were starting to realize just how much trouble they were in. Aaliyah had struck, and it wasn't with force, it was with the weight of the truth. The judge, despite his earlier attempts to assert control, sat with his hands clasped in front of him. He glanced over the room nervously, his eyes searching for some kind of direction. But there was no one to guide him, no one to rescue him from the unraveling mess. He was part of the very system Aaliyah had been working to expose, and now, the very foundation of that system was cracking. She could feel the tension in the air, but it didn't faze her. She had been in situations like this before, where the odds seemed impossible. She had faced those who tried to bring her down, to silence her. But she had always stood tall, unwavering, and today was no different. "You can't do this," Harper finally blurted out, his voice shaking. "You have no right." Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, her gaze unbroken. "I have every right," she replied coolly. "The truth always has the right to be heard." The officer's jaw clenched, and he shot a quick, nervous glance at the judge. The realization was setting in. There was no way to escape this. The room was starting to feel smaller, as though the walls were closing in on the men who had believed they were untouchable. Aaliyah didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to shout or make a scene. Her very presence commanded authority. She had the upper hand, and she knew it. The room was still, but the undercurrent of anxiety rippling through it was undeniable. The other officers, who had been complicit in the systemic injustices that Aaliyah had been investigating for months, looked around, each of them beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation. They had thought they could control the narrative, that they could bury the truth. But now, the truth was standing right in front of them, and they couldn't hide from it any longer. The judge cleared his throat, his voice faltering as he spoke. I don't know what to say," he muttered, glancing nervously at Aaliyah. "This is beyond the scope of my authority." Aaliyah straightened, her posture resolute. "Then step aside," she said, her voice steady, but with a commanding edge. The judge didn't respond, his silence louder than any words could have been. He knew he had no power here. The power had shifted. The officers had overestimated their ability to suppress the truth. Now, Aaliyah was the one in charge. And there was no turning back. She had played her hand, and the consequences were inevitable. The room grew heavier with every passing second, and the tension continued to build. Harper shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his mind racing. He had no idea what Aaliyah would do next, but he feared the worst. The truth was a weapon he had never anticipated. He was a man who had lived his life believing that his badge and his position of power would protect him from the consequences of his actions. But Aaliyah had just stripped him of that illusion. She was a force unlike anything he had ever faced, and he knew he was no match for her. Aaliyah stood tall, her gaze unwavering as she looked at the other officers in the room. They were all beginning to understand. This wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about the entire system, about a corrupt network that had allowed men like Harper to abuse their power without fear of repercussion. But Aaliyah wasn't just going to expose them. She was going to make sure they paid for it. The courtroom remained silent as she walked toward the front, her eyes never leaving the judge or the officers. The weight of the moment was almost too much for them to bear. Harper's fear was palpable now. He wasn't just worried about his career. He was worried about something much worse, something that no badge could protect him from. Aaliyah had the power to dismantle everything he had built, and he knew it. As Aaliyah reached the front of the courtroom, she turned to face the room, her voice calm but commanding. "The truth always finds its way to the surface," she said, her words ringing out, clear and resolute. "And today, it will change everything." The room was still as she finished speaking, but the energy in the air had shifted completely. The men who had thought they controlled the room, who had thought they could manipulate the system, now sat in silence, realizing they were powerless. Aaliyah had taken control, and she wasn't about to let go. Aaliyah stood in front of the courtroom, the weight of her words still hanging in the air. The officers who once ruled the room with their authority were now visibly shaken. Harper, who had been the loudest voice in the room moments ago, sat in stunned silence. His hands were trembling, his confidence completely shattered. The judge, too, seemed lost. The power dynamics had completely shifted. No one in the room had anticipated this. They had assumed that their position of authority would shield them from any consequences, but Aaliyah had just proven them wrong. She wasn't just a victim of their system, she was a force of change. As the room settled into an uncomfortable quiet, Aaliyah took a step forward, her gaze still unwavering. She wasn't done yet. She had come this far, but there was more to be done. The truth was out now, but justice wasn't something that could be handed to her. She would have to take it. Her every movement was deliberate, calculated. The officers, once so confident in their ability to control the situation, were now at a loss. They had underestimated her, and now they would pay the price. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "This is highly irregular," he muttered, still not fully grasping the situation. But Aaliyah wasn't interested in his words. She had heard them all before. The excuses, the apologies, the meaningless words that came from people who had never been held accountable. She had no time for them now. "You can't ignore this," Aaliyah said, her voice calm but firm. "The truth is here, and it's not going away." The judge faltered, the weight of her words settling in. He had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. Aaliyah could see it in his eyes. He knew what was at stake now. He knew that any further attempt to dismiss what had happened would be a betrayal of justice itself. The officers, too, were beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. They had thought they could hide behind their badges, behind the system that had protected them for so long. But now, the truth was in the open, and they were exposed. They were no longer untouchable. Harper, still sitting in his seat, shifted uncomfortably. He had always believed that his badge would protect him, that his position would shield him from the consequences of his actions. But now, faced with the undeniable truth, he realized how wrong he had been. Aaliyah didn't need to raise her voice to make her point. She didn't need to shout or make a spectacle of herself. Her presence alone was enough to command attention. She was the embodiment of justice, and the officers in the room knew it. There was no escaping it. The room was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of papers or the soft click of a gavel. But Aaliyah remained steady. She had fought for too long to let this moment slip away. The system that had allowed men like Harper to rise to power had to be dismantled, and she was the one who would do it. "You'll regret this," Harper muttered again, though his voice lacked the confidence it once had. Aaliyah didn't respond. There was no need. Her actions had already spoken louder than any words could. The truth was out, and now it was time for justice to follow. The judge, looking as though he might crumble under the weight of the situation, finally stood. "This court will reconvene after a brief recess," he said, though his voice was weak. He knew, as everyone else did, that the course of this trial had changed forever. Aaliyah didn't move. She simply watched as the judge left the bench, his authority no longer as solid as it once was. The officers stood too, looking as if they were trying to figure out their next move. They had been caught in their own web of lies, and now they were left to pick up the pieces. But Aaliyah wasn't concerned with what they would do next. She had already won. The truth had been revealed, and there was no going back. The officers would face the consequences of their actions, and Aaliyah would make sure of it. As the recess began, she stood there, her posture tall and resolute. She had come to this point not just to seek justice for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. She was a symbol of resilience, of the power of truth. And nothing, no one, could take that away from her. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The road ahead would be long, but Aaliyah knew she was on the right path. And with every step she took, the world around her would change. Justice was no longer a distant dream. It was a reality, and Aaliyah was the one who would make sure it prevailed. As the brief recess continued, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Aaliyah stood, her posture unwavering, as the judge and officers retreated to their respective chambers. The hum of murmurs and whispered conversations filled the room, but Aaliyah remained calm. Her thoughts were clear, focused on what needed to come next. This was no longer just about one officer, one trial, or one courtroom. This was about exposing a broken system, about bringing to light the corruption and injustice that had long been hidden behind closed doors. She had already taken the first step. Now, she needed to make sure that the truth would be heard loud and clear. As the doors to the courtroom opened again, the judge returned to the bench, his expression still clouded with uncertainty. The officers followed, and the room fell silent once more. Aaliyah's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of the judge, the officers, and the few spectators who remained. She could see the unease in their eyes, the growing awareness of their own vulnerability. The power dynamics had shifted, and they all knew it. The judge cleared his throat and began, his voice shaky as he addressed the room. "We will proceed with this trial," he said, his words carrying less weight than before. "But there are issues that need to be addressed." Aaliyah watched him carefully, her eyes never leaving his. She knew he was struggling to regain control of the situation, but it was clear to everyone that the control he once held was slipping away. The officers, still uneasy, took their places. Harper, in particular, seemed to shrink into his seat, his bravado replaced by an almost palpable fear. Aaliyah could feel it. He knew the walls were closing in. She had the truth on her side. She had the evidence. And now, it was time for the final act. The judge looked at Aaliyah, his gaze more focused now, and nodded. "You have the floor," he said quietly. Aaliyah stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor, the sound sharp in the stillness of the room. She didn't need to say anything right away. She knew the impact of her presence alone was enough to command attention. The officers shifted in their seats, unsure of what to expect. Aaliyah paused for a moment, allowing the silence to stretch, building the anticipation. Finally, she spoke. "What you've seen here today is just the tip of the iceberg," she began, her voice calm, but carrying an undeniable authority. "The corruption, the abuse of power, it's all part of a larger system that has been allowed to thrive for far too long. And I'm not here to let it continue." Her words rang out in the courtroom, the weight of them settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. The officers who had once believed they were invincible, who had thought their actions would go unchallenged, now felt the sting of her words. "You see," Aaliyah continued, "this isn't just about one officer, one trial, or one bad decision. This is about a pattern of behavior. It's about a system that's been rigged against those who are vulnerable. And I'm here to fix that." The room was quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of papers and the occasional cough. The officers sat in stunned silence, unable to respond. Harper's earlier confidence had completely evaporated, and the others were left unsure of what to do. Aaliyah knew that the battle wasn't over, but it was close. She could feel the tide of change beginning to turn. The judge, still reeling from the earlier revelation, nodded slowly. "We'll have to take a short break," he said, clearly unsure of how to proceed. "But we will reconvene shortly." As the room emptied, Aaliyah stood tall, knowing that the next step would be just as important as the last. She had exposed the cracks in the system. Now, it was time to widen those cracks until the whole thing came crumbling down. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all those who had been silenced, for all those who had suffered under a system that was designed to oppress them. Outside the courtroom, Aaliyah took a deep breath. She had made her mark, but she knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The fight for justice was never easy. It was always complicated, always fraught with obstacles. But she was ready. She had come this far, and she wouldn't stop now. The wheels of justice were turning, and she would be there every step of the way, making sure that the truth was heard and that the system that had failed so many would finally be held accountable. As the recess continued, Aaliyah sat in silence, her mind racing with the events that had just transpired. She had made her mark, exposed the truth, and shaken the foundation of the courtroom, but she knew that this was only the beginning. The real battle was still ahead. The officers, once so confident in their power, were now left with nothing but the weight of their own guilt. Their actions had been exposed, their corruption laid bare for all to see. Aaliyah could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The room was no longer filled with the arrogance of those who thought they were untouchable. It was now filled with the uneasy realization that the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how hard they tried to bury it. The judge, still reeling from the revelation, was not the same man who had entered the courtroom hours earlier. Aaliyah could see it in his eyes. He was afraid. The power he once held was slipping through his fingers, and he knew that his next move would determine everything. Aaliyah remained calm, knowing that the next steps were crucial. She had fought for justice her entire life. But this time, the stakes were higher. This time, the system itself was on trial. As the judge called for the court to reconvene, Aaliyah stood, her resolve unwavering. She knew that the real test was not just in exposing the corruption, but in ensuring that the system would change. The officers, still shaken, took their places at the defendant's table. They no longer carried the same confidence they once had. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting nervously as they waited for the next phase of the trial. Aaliyah could see the fear in their eyes, and it fueled her determination. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and ridiculed, but now it was clear that she was the one in control. The judge cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he addressed the room once more. "We will continue with the trial," he said, but his words lacked the authority they once carried. The room, once filled with tension, was now thick with uncertainty. The officers knew that they were no longer in control. Aaliyah had taken the power back, and there was nothing they could do to stop her. "It's not too late," the judge said, looking at Aaliyah with a mixture of fear and desperation. "We can find a way to resolve this." Aaliyah's gaze never wavered. She knew what needed to be done. "There's nothing to resolve," she said firmly. "The truth has already been revealed. It's time for justice." The room fell silent as the judge's eyes shifted uncomfortably. He had no response. The truth was undeniable. The officers had been caught, their actions exposed for everyone to see. Aaliyah wasn't just seeking justice for herself. She was fighting for every person who had been wronged by a corrupt system. She was fighting for change. The officers, realizing they had no way out, began to look at each other nervously. Harper, in particular, seemed to shrink under Aaliyah's gaze. He had once believed that his badge and his position would protect him, but now he realized how wrong he had been. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the papers in front of him. Aaliyah saw the fear in his eyes, and she knew that he was no longer the confident officer he had once been. The truth had shattered him, just as it had shattered the system they had relied on for so long. The judge, clearly defeated, looked down at his papers. The trial was no longer about legal arguments or courtroom theatrics. It was about something far more important: accountability. Aaliyah had proven that no one, no matter their rank or title, was above the law. As the trial continued, Aaliyah felt a sense of peace. The fight was far from over, but she knew that the tide had turned. She had exposed the truth, and now the world would see it. The officers who had once believed they could hide behind their badges, behind their positions of power, were now facing the consequences of their actions. Aaliyah had shown them that justice could not be silenced, no matter how hard they tried to bury it. She had fought for justice not just for herself, but for every person who had been silenced by a broken system. And as the trial continued, she knew that this was just the beginning. The system would change, and she would be there to make sure it did. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted completely. What had once been a place of controlled power and arrogance was now filled with uncertainty and fear. Aaliyah stood, poised and calm, as the judge and the officers at the defendant's table tried to regain their composure. The weight of the truth had settled over them like a heavy blanket, suffocating any attempts at resistance. The judge cleared his throat again, his hands shaking slightly as he looked at Aaliyah. It was clear he had no control left. The system he had been a part of, the one that had sheltered him and those like him, was unraveling. And now, there was no way to pretend that things could go back to normal. "We need to take this into consideration," the judge finally said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "The situation here is unprecedented." Aaliyah didn't flinch at his words. She had heard it all before: the excuses, the justifications, the attempts to delay the inevitable. This was not just about her or this moment. It was about dismantling a corrupt system that had allowed abuse to go unchecked for too long. "The system isn't broken," she said, her voice cutting through the air. "It was built this way. It was designed to protect people like you and make sure that people like me stay out of the picture. But that ends today." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the words hanging in the air like a warning. The officers at the defendant's table shifted uneasily. They had believed that they could keep their power hidden behind their badges, their position in the system, but now the truth was out. They had been exposed. Harper, who had once worn his confidence like a shield, now looked like a man who had just seen his world crumble around him. His shoulders were slumped, and his eyes darted around the room, searching for someone to help him, to give him an answer. But there was no one left to save him. The truth had a way of doing that, stripping away the illusions and leaving nothing but the raw reality of what had been done. I've spent my life fighting for justice, Aaliyah continued, her eyes never leaving the judge, and I'm not going to stop now. Not for you, not for anyone. This is about making sure that everyone, no matter their rank, their power, their title, understands that no one is above the law. She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was still, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The officers, the judge, everyone in that room knew that she was speaking the truth. The power dynamics had shifted, and they were no longer in control. Aaliyah had taken the power back. The judge, still processing the shift in authority, took a deep breath before speaking again. I understand your position, he said, though the words sounded hollow. He wasn't speaking to Aaliyah anymore. He was speaking to himself, trying to convince himself that there was still a way to regain some control. But you must understand the consequences of what you're asking for. Aaliyah stepped forward, her voice unwavering. I'm asking for accountability, she said, her words precise and deliberate. I'm asking for the truth to be acknowledged, for the system to be held accountable for what it's done. No more excuses. No more delays. This ends today. There was no more room for negotiation, no more room for empty promises. The truth was out, and it couldn't be undone. The officers who had once believed they were invincible now knew better. Harper, in particular, had been the loudest, the most arrogant, but now he was the most afraid. Aaliyah had shown him what it meant to face the consequences of his actions. The judge sat back, his shoulders sagging. He had no response. The truth had stripped him of his power. The officers, too, had no words. They had nothing left to say. The moment of truth had come, and Aaliyah had won. She had exposed the corruption, the lies, the injustices that had been hidden for so long. And now, the system would change. Aaliyah turned to face the officers one last time, her eyes locking with Harper's. There was no need for further words. The damage had been done. You failed, she said quietly, but her voice carried enough weight to shatter whatever confidence Harper had left. But I haven't. Not yet. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as Aaliyah's words echoed in the air. The fight was far from over, but Aaliyah knew that the first victory had been won. She had exposed the truth, and now there was no going back. The officers, the judge, and everyone who had once been complicit in this system of injustice were about to face the consequences. And Aaliyah would be there every step of the way, ensuring that justice was served. The tension in the courtroom was almost suffocating as Aaliyah stood tall, her gaze unwavering. She had done it. She had exposed the truth, and now the repercussions were beginning to unfold. The officers who had once stood with a sense of invulnerability now sat in stunned silence. Harper, the most vocal and arrogant of them all, had become a shadow of the man he once was. His confidence, once a shield, had evaporated, leaving him with nothing but the cold reality of his actions. The judge, still reeling from the earlier revelations, seemed to be at a loss. He had no words to offer, no excuses left to make. The weight of the truth was pressing down on him, and for the first time in this entire trial, Aaliyah saw the cracks in his composure. She had always known that the system was built to protect the powerful, to shield those who had the resources and influence to manipulate the law. But now, the system was breaking. It wasn't just about the officers who had been caught in their lies. It was about the entire system that had allowed this to happen. Aaliyah had known from the beginning that exposing the truth was just the first step. The real work was about to begin. She wasn't here for a small victory. She was here to dismantle a system that had failed too many for too long. The judge cleared his throat again, trying to regain some semblance of control. This court will reconvene shortly, he said, his voice weak. It was clear that he was struggling. The authority he once held was slipping away with every passing moment. Aaliyah didn't need to hear any more. She had made her point, and now the next steps were clear. She had to ensure that the truth didn't just disappear into the void. She couldn't allow the corruption to continue. As the court adjourned, Aaliyah walked out of the room, her mind already focused on what needed to be done. The officers, though clearly shaken, began to gather their things, their once confident demeanor now replaced with a sense of panic. Aaliyah could feel their eyes on her as she passed, but she didn't let them faze her. She had the power now, and they knew it. Outside the courtroom, Aaliyah took a deep breath. The battle was far from over, but this was a significant turning point. She had done what she came here to do. She had exposed the truth. Now, she would take the next steps. She knew that there would be those who would try to undermine her efforts, who would try to sweep the truth back under the rug. But she was ready for that. She wasn't going to stop until the system had been forced to change. Aaliyah knew that the road ahead would be long. She had seen the depths of corruption, the lengths to which those in power would go to protect their own. But she also knew that the system was finally being held accountable. And she would be there every step of the way to make sure it stayed that way. Back in the courtroom, the officers had gathered, exchanging hurried words with each other. They were still trying to make sense of what had just happened. They had assumed that their positions of power would shield them from the consequences of their actions. But now, they were faced with the truth, and it was too late to turn back. Harper, still visibly shaken, turned to one of his colleagues. "What now?" he asked, his voice low. His colleague didn't answer right away. He was still trying to process the events that had just unfolded. The entire room had been turned upside down. The one person they thought they could dismiss had just proven that they were no match for her. The thought lingered in the air, unspoken but understood by all. "We need to get ahead of this," the officer finally said. His voice was strained, but there was a sense of urgency in it. They all knew that Aaliyah was a force they couldn't ignore. They had to act fast if they had any hope of saving themselves. Aaliyah, meanwhile, had no intention of giving them that chance. She had already set the wheels in motion. The truth had been laid bare, and now, the entire system would have to reckon with it. She wasn't going to let anyone sweep it away, not now, not ever. As the days passed, the events of the trial reverberated throughout the city, and soon, the entire country. The news spread quickly, and the public's response was overwhelming. People who had been silent for so long began to speak out, demanding change. Aaliyah had ignited a spark, and now, it was up to everyone to keep the fire burning. She had no illusions about how difficult the path ahead would be. The system she was fighting against was deeply entrenched, and there were powerful forces at work. But she was ready. She had already faced down those who thought they could break her. And now, she was ready to take on the fight that would define everything. The system had failed too many. But Aaliyah knew that it didn't have to stay that way. Change was coming, and she was going to make sure of it. The days following the trial were nothing short of transformative. Aaliyah had broken through the walls of corruption that had surrounded her, and now, the ripple effects were spreading. She knew that the fight was far from over, but she also understood that she had struck a powerful blow to the system. As she walked through the busy streets, she could feel the eyes of the people on her. There were whispers of respect, admiration, and even awe. The truth she had fought so hard to expose was now undeniable, and the world was taking notice. Aaliyah had become a symbol of resilience, of someone who refused to back down in the face of adversity. And yet, despite the victory she had won, there was still a quiet undercurrent of worry inside her. The system she had taken on was vast, deeply ingrained, and filled with people who would stop at nothing to protect their own. But Aaliyah was ready. She had made it this far, and she wasn't about to stop now. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable as the next steps began to unfold. The officers who had once been in control were now scrambling to cover their tracks. Their earlier confidence had disappeared, replaced by panic. They had thought they were untouchable, but Aaliyah had shown them just how fragile that belief was. Harper, who had once seemed so sure of himself, now appeared lost. His eyes darted nervously around the room as he tried to find a way to salvage the situation. But the truth had already been set in motion, and there was no turning back. The courtroom that had once felt like a place of unchallenged authority now seemed like a place of reckoning. The officers who had once been untouchable were now facing the consequences of their actions. Aaliyah stood at the center of it all, unwavering. She had done what she set out to do, expose the truth. But she knew that this was just the beginning. The system she had fought against was not one that would fall easily. The fight would be long, but she was prepared for it. As the court proceedings continued, the judge, who had once seemed so secure in his position, now appeared visibly shaken. The cracks in his authority were now impossible to ignore. Aaliyah could see the struggle within him. He had been forced to confront the reality of what had been happening in his own courtroom. The officers, too, were beginning to feel the weight of their actions. They had been caught, and there was no way to hide from the truth anymore. "We need to address the situation," the judge said, his voice trembling slightly. The words were an attempt at authority, but they lacked the conviction they once had. Aaliyah didn't flinch. She knew that no matter what the judge said, the outcome had already been decided. "The situation has been addressed," she replied calmly. "The truth has come to light. Now it's time for accountability." The room fell silent as the reality of her words settled in. There was no room for excuses anymore. The truth had been laid bare, and it was clear that the system had failed. The judge nodded slowly, his eyes heavy with the weight of the moment. He had no choice but to acknowledge what had happened. The officers, who had once believed they could escape justice, were now facing the consequences of their actions. The truth was undeniable. The room, once filled with the sounds of legal jargon and formal proceedings, was now filled with the uncomfortable silence of people facing the truth. Aaliyah's presence in the room had shifted everything. She wasn't just a witness. She wasn't just a victim. She was the catalyst for change. She had fought for justice, and now the system would be forced to reckon with its failures. "We'll take the necessary steps to ensure justice is served," the judge finally said, though his words lacked the conviction they once held. He was trying to maintain some sense of authority, but it was clear to everyone in the room that his power had waned. Aaliyah nodded, her expression resolute. She had done what she needed to do. The next steps were out of her hands, but she knew that the fight would continue. As she walked out of the courtroom, she could feel the weight of the moment. The battle had been hard, and the journey ahead would be even harder. But she was ready. Aaliyah had proven that even the most entrenched systems of power could be shaken. She had shown the world that the truth would always find a way to the surface, no matter how hard those in power tried to hide it. And as she stepped out into the world, she knew that her fight was far from over. The system was big, but Aaliyah was bigger, and she wasn't going anywhere. The days after the courtroom battle passed slowly, but the weight of what had transpired never left Aaliyah. She knew that change was coming, but she also knew that it would be a long and difficult road ahead. The victory was hers, but there was much more to do. As the city around her buzzed with conversations of the trial, of the corruption that had been exposed, Aaliyah focused on the next steps. She had shattered the silence, but now she had to keep the momentum going. The ripple effects of her actions were already being felt. People who had been silenced for so long were now speaking up, their voices joining the chorus of change that Aaliyah had started. The media, too, began to pick up the story. Headlines across the country buzzed with the story of the powerful CIA agent who had exposed the rot in the system. Aaliyah had become a symbol of hope, of courage in the face of adversity. But as much as the world was starting to recognize her efforts, Aaliyah knew the fight was far from over. The system she had challenged was vast, and there were still powerful figures who would do whatever they could to protect it. There were whispers in the shadows, those who sought to undo everything Aaliyah had fought for. But she wasn't afraid. She had seen what the truth could do. It had shattered their defenses, exposed their lies. Now, she would make sure that the changes she had started would take root. The first step was to continue to expose the depth of the corruption. She worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, reaching out to those who had been wronged. She spoke to victims of the system, to families who had lost loved ones, to those who had been marginalized and oppressed. Their stories were powerful, and Aaliyah knew that they were the key to bringing about real change. As she gathered her information, Aaliyah kept a low profile. She knew that the more she exposed, the more those in power would come after her. But she was prepared. She had been fighting for justice her entire life, and she wasn't about to stop now. Every piece of evidence, every story, brought her closer to her goal. She wasn't just trying to change the system. She was trying to build a new one that would serve the people, not the powerful. Her work wasn't just about dismantling the old structures. It was about building something better, something fairer. It was about creating a system that would no longer turn a blind eye to the suffering of the vulnerable. Aaliyah's days were filled with meetings, phone calls, and late-night research. She spoke to journalists, gathered allies, and strategized on how best to bring about the changes she knew were necessary. And all the while, she remained vigilant. She knew that the people who had tried to silence her before would stop at nothing to keep their hold on power. But Aaliyah was no longer the woman they could ignore. She had made her mark, and now she was determined to see it through. The city, once so full of secrets, was beginning to change. People who had once been afraid to speak out were now finding their voices. Aaliyah's influence was growing, and with it, the possibility of a real, lasting transformation. The media continued to follow her every move, and soon, she found herself on the front pages of newspapers across the nation. Her story was no longer just about a courtroom victory. It was about a movement for justice, for truth, for accountability. But even as her influence spread, Aaliyah knew that she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, people who would stand with her, who would fight for the same ideals. And she found them: lawyers, activists, and everyday citizens who had been inspired by her courage began to rally behind her. Together, they formed a coalition, a united front determined to change the system from the inside out. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Aaliyah felt a sense of hope. She had come so far, and the world was watching. The fight was far from over, but she knew that with each passing day, she was one step closer to achieving the change she had always dreamed of. As the city around her continued to buzz with excitement, Aaliyah remained focused. The truth had been set free, and now it was time to rebuild. She knew that the fight would be long, but with every victory, every step forward, the system would change. She had proven that it could be done, and now she was going to make sure it happened. Aaliyah had taken on the system, and she was determined to bring about the change that was long overdue. The weeks following the formation of her coalition were filled with a growing sense of urgency and possibility. Aaliyah was no longer just a symbol of change, she was the very embodiment of it. The coalition she had formed with lawyers, activists, and everyday citizens was gaining momentum, each day bringing new allies, new supporters, and most importantly, new opportunities to push the truth even further into the public eye. The media, which had once portrayed her merely as a courageous woman in a courtroom, now saw her as a leader, a force that could not be ignored. Headlines and news outlets were abuzz with her name, and as her story spread, so did the movement she had sparked. But despite all the attention and recognition, Aaliyah remained focused. She knew that the real work had only just begun. The system she was trying to change was deeply entrenched, with roots that went far beyond one courthouse, one judge, or even one corrupt officer. It stretched across the very fabric of the city, and in some ways, across the nation. To take it on, Aaliyah knew she had to be strategic. The truth had been exposed, but now she needed to ensure that the forces behind the lies were held accountable, and that the changes she sought would be more than just temporary fixes. There was a long road ahead, but Aaliyah had never been one to shy away from a challenge. She had learned long ago that change didn't come easily, especially when it was so deeply resisted. Her mornings began early, filled with meetings and planning sessions. Her afternoons spent meeting with community leaders and organizing events. She had become a tireless advocate for justice, her voice growing stronger with every person she met. And yet, there were moments, especially in the quiet of the night, when doubts crept in. Aaliyah knew that her efforts would face immense resistance from those who had the most to lose. There were powerful people, hidden in the shadows, who were doing everything they could to keep things the way they had always been. But even in those quiet moments of doubt, Aaliyah reminded herself of why she was doing this. She was not doing it for recognition, not for the accolades or the praise. She was doing it because it was necessary, because the system had failed too many people for too long. And for that reason, she couldn't stop now. In the weeks that followed, the coalition began to make real strides. They brought cases of injustice to light, rallied citizens to protest against corrupt practices, and pushed for legislative changes. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments when it felt like the odds were too great to overcome. But Aaliyah's resolve never wavered. She had seen too much, and she had already given too much of herself to turn back. With each new victory, her belief in the power of the people grew stronger. She began to see the change she had dreamed of, little by little, taking shape. One of the most powerful moments came when the media began to pick up the stories of those who had suffered under the system, stories that had been ignored for far too long. Aaliyah had always known that the real power of change lay in the voices of the people, and now those voices were finally being heard. The stories were raw, painful, and powerful, but they were also inspiring, a testament to the strength and resilience of those who had been overlooked for so long. The more people spoke out, the more it became clear that the movement Aaliyah had started was not just about exposing the truth. It was about empowering those who had been silenced. It was about building a future where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a reality. The pressure was mounting, both on Aaliyah and the coalition she had formed. But Aaliyah knew that the harder the fight, the greater the reward. She wasn't just fighting for a better future for herself, or even for her allies. She was fighting for every person who had ever been wronged by the system. And as the movement grew, so did the realization that they were making real progress. Change was no longer an abstract hope. It was happening. Aaliyah saw it in the eyes of the people who joined her at rallies, in the voices of those who had been fighting for justice long before her, and in the leaders who were willing to stand with her. There was no turning back now. The momentum was building, and Aaliyah was at the center of it all, leading the charge for a better tomorrow. The world around her was beginning to shift, and she could feel it. She knew it would take time, and there would be setbacks. But with every step forward, with every person who stood beside her, Aaliyah knew that the system she had once been up against would not stand for long. Justice was coming. And this time, it wasn't just a dream. It was a reality that was being built, piece by piece, day by day. As Aaliyah moved through the days following her latest victories, the weight of her actions felt even more profound. The coalition she had worked tirelessly to build was now a well-oiled machine, pushing forward with a strength and determination that seemed unstoppable. Every victory they achieved, every case they brought to light, was a step closer to the changes Aaliyah had always known were possible. Yet, despite the progress, she could not ignore the immense pressure that had built up over time. The system she was fighting was not going to dismantle itself. Every success was met with resistance from those who had the most to lose. Behind closed doors, powerful figures who had once hidden in the shadows began to react. Aaliyah knew that as her movement gained more traction, they would do everything in their power to stop her. But she was ready. She had been prepared for this fight from the moment she decided to stand up and expose the truth. She had been underestimated for so long, and now it was clear this was no longer just about one case, one officer, or one courtroom. This was about a revolution, a change in the very fabric of the system itself. As the movement grew, so did the challenges. Aaliyah found herself more and more in the public eye. Interviews, speeches, and meetings filled her days, but she never lost sight of her mission. She knew that her role was not just to fight for justice for herself, or even for the people directly affected by the corruption. It was bigger than that. Aaliyah was fighting to make sure that future generations would never have to face the same injustices. She wanted to build a world where people no longer had to fear the very system that was supposed to protect them. The journey was far from easy. As the coalition gained ground, they faced new hurdles. Politicians, media outlets, and even some of the public tried to discredit them, casting doubts on their motives, questioning their actions. But Aaliyah had faced much worse. She had been called names, dismissed, and ignored, but she had never backed down. The pressure only fueled her determination to keep moving forward. One day, while walking to one of her many meetings, Aaliyah received a call from one of her key allies. "Aaliyah, you need to prepare yourself," the voice on the other end said. "There's something you need to see." Aaliyah's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. She had learned not to fear the unknown, not to back away from what was coming. She trusted her instincts. "What's happened?" she asked, her voice steady. "They've found new evidence," the ally replied. "It's big, and it could change everything." Aaliyah knew this was the moment they had been waiting for. This was the breakthrough that could push everything into the open, forcing the change they had been fighting for. She quickly gathered her team and prepared for the next phase of their strategy. The next few days were filled with intense preparation. They worked late into the night, strategizing their next move, ensuring that every detail was in place. Aaliyah was more focused than ever. The evidence they had uncovered was undeniable. It wasn't just a piece of the puzzle. It was the key to unlocking everything. But as the days passed and the pressure mounted, Aaliyah found herself feeling the weight of the responsibility she had taken on. She had asked for this. She had pushed for this change. But the burden of leading such a movement was heavy. Still, she couldn't afford to stop now. Not when they were so close. The moment finally arrived. Aaliyah stood before a crowd of supporters, journalists, and activists. The media was there, cameras flashing, waiting for her to speak. As she walked to the podium, the weight of the moment settled over her. She could feel the eyes of the world on her, but she didn't let it affect her. She had a mission, and nothing was going to stop her from completing it. Today, we take another step forward, Aaliyah began, her voice strong and clear. We've uncovered the truth. And now, the world will know it. The crowd erupted into applause, but Aaliyah remained calm. She knew that the real work had only just begun. She was about to release the evidence they had gathered, evidence that would shake the very core of the system they had been fighting against. With a deep breath, Aaliyah continued, "This isn't just about exposing the corruption. This is about rebuilding a system that serves everyone, not just the powerful. We are creating a future where justice is not a privilege, it is a right." As she spoke, Aaliyah could feel the weight of her words. They were no longer just a call for change. They were the foundation for the future she was determined to build. The applause grew louder, but Aaliyah's focus remained on the task at hand. She had started this fight for justice, and she would finish it, for herself, for her supporters, and for the generations to come. The road ahead was uncertain, but Aaliyah knew one thing for sure. The truth was unstoppable. And with that truth, they would tear down the walls that had held the system in place for so long. This was the beginning of a new era, and Aaliyah would lead the charge. The press conference Aaliyah had called was a defining moment in her journey. She had revealed the truth to the world, but now, it was time for the next steps. As the cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, she felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She was no longer just a woman fighting for justice. She was the leader of a movement that had the power to change everything. She had started this fight for truth, but now, she was leading the charge for systemic reform. The story of her triumph over the corrupt officers had ignited a fire of hope in the hearts of many. People who had felt helpless for so long were now standing up, speaking out, and demanding change. Aaliyah had become the face of a revolution, one that sought to dismantle the systems of oppression that had governed their lives for far too long. But as the excitement of the press conference died down and the world began to digest the enormity of what had just happened, Aaliyah was reminded that the hardest work was still ahead. The battle against the system wasn't won in a single moment, not even in a single victory. It was a long, ongoing process that would require every ounce of her strength, determination, and resilience. As the days passed, Aaliyah watched as more and more people stepped forward, sharing their own stories of injustice. These were the stories of ordinary people whose voices had been silenced by the very systems that were supposed to protect them. But now, they were rising up. They were sharing their pain, their anger, and their hope for a better future. Aaliyah knew that the stories of those who had suffered under the system were not just powerful, they were essential. It was the people who had lived through the injustices who would fuel the movement for change. And they needed to be heard. She spent countless hours meeting with victims, listening to their stories, and offering them a platform to be heard. The media continued to cover the movement, but Aaliyah knew that it couldn't stop there. She needed the lawmakers, the people in power, to hear these stories. She needed to push for legislative reform, to make sure that the justice system worked for everyone, not just the privileged few. The coalition she had built continued to grow, with more and more people joining their efforts. Lawyers, community leaders, activists, and even former law enforcement officers who had been disillusioned with the system stood alongside her, all united by the same goal: a fair, just society where everyone's rights were protected. They held rallies, marched in the streets, and lobbied lawmakers. And with each passing day, Aaliyah could feel the pressure mounting on the people who had once held the power. The cracks in the system were beginning to widen, and it was clear that those in positions of authority were running out of ways to cover up the truth. As she navigated the growing movement, Aaliyah stayed focused on her end goal: accountability. She had exposed the truth, but that wasn't enough. She needed to make sure that those responsible for the corruption were held accountable for their actions. It wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about creating a system where the truth couldn't be buried anymore. Aaliyah's work had always been about more than just one case, one injustice. It was about transforming the entire system. And while the battle was far from over, she could already see the seeds of change beginning to sprout. One evening, as she sat alone in her office, reviewing documents and preparing for a new round of meetings, Aaliyah allowed herself a moment of reflection. The journey had been long, and the road ahead would be even longer. But she had come so far, and as she looked at the progress they had made, she knew that this was just the beginning. She had once been a lone voice, fighting for justice in a system that had silenced her. But now, she was not alone. She had the support of a nation behind her. Aaliyah leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle in. She wasn't done yet, but she had already changed the course of history. The power of the people was undeniable, and together, they would create the change they had long dreamed of. Aaliyah opened her eyes, a renewed sense of purpose driving her forward. The work was far from over, but now, she had the strength of a movement behind her. And with that strength, there was nothing they couldn't accomplish.